And we're live.
And we're live. All right. Hello, everybody. This is Tom Linsky, and we have Matthew DeWinkler and Kyle Hudak here for our third Titanic Week podcast. I got the sun coming right through my window, hitting my eyes. Oh, let me fix that. This is the third podcast of the week, right?
I think, yes, it is now.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, today we're going to be talking about the miracles of the Titanic. It's a catchy title we decided to come up with, where we're going to be discussing things that seemed bad about the Titanic story that ultimately turned out to be good. So we have about 175 people listening in right now, and the numbers are climbing pretty quickly. So I'm going to wait for a little bit and let that number go up so that everyone has a chance to come in and get comfortable and listen for a little bit. And then we'll go into all the details. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm looking forward to this one. This is going to be a very interesting podcast, especially since we literally came up with the contents 15 minutes ago.
That's not true.
Well, you're right.
It's half true. We just discussed it again 15 minutes ago. Because we thought we were doing the collision one until 15 minutes ago.
We lost track of the dates. See, that's what Titanic Week does to us. We're always so busy with stuff because we've got so many interviews to respond to, or things to post, or videos to edit, or images to create, and that it's overwhelming. So it's a lot of stuff for the three of us to balance. And again, that's why the demo trailer hasn't been released yet. We're not deliberately holding out on you guys or anything like that. It's just some stuff comes up. It's going to come out. But the good news is the longer we wait to make that, to complete that demo teaser trailer, the more we can add to it. And I can tell you that every day that goes by, we enhance it more. We add something cool, which is ultimately going to be in the demo anyway. So trust us when we say that these extra few days for the demo trailer are really going to pay off. So the number's still going up, which is cool. We're up to 260 now. And 270 just jumped. Got people coming in pretty quickly, which is awesome. So today is April 13th. No.
Or April 12th.
Or April 12th, depending on what part of the world you're in.
That's true.
Yeah, well, see, there's the perfect example of our sense of time being thrown off, or at least mine. Today is April 12th.
I'm pretty sure where Titanic is, it's still the 12th, though.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
So today's April 12th. This is Titanic's first full day out in the open waters. Yesterday, it left Ireland, leaving Europe behind completely. And for the last time, for many of Titanic's passengers, that was their last opportunity to ever see land. Now we're out on the open sea, and it's a relatively uneventful day. The weather is pretty good. The ship is making decent speed. It's got good mileage under its belt. It's coming along. It's not doing full speed. It never really does full speed during the voyage. Matt, are there any real events today, or is this just literally an uneventful day?
Well, really, every day for Titanic was uneventful, except for, the last day. It's just a normal day at sea. The weather's pretty good. She does pick up speed a little bit, but like you said, she never goes to her full abilities. So yeah, it's just a normal day at speed. Everyone enjoyed it.
Right.
They always kept saying like the next day at sea is better than the day before.
Why is that?
Oh, it just seemed to be getting better and better to them. Like they couldn't believe that like the next that each day could be improved upon, either for the passengers anyway.
Right.
That the food could be improved, or the entertainment in the band, or just the ship itself could just keep getting. It could be better, and it just seemed like this world that they were living in is just it kept it seems to be the world of Titanic. It's one of those another one of these legends of Titanic is how grand it is and just increasing in grandeur, but it did until disaster struck.
See, when you said every day at sea is better than the last, I never heard that before. I didn't know if you meant that like as an idiom or something like that. But okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, as you said, the voyage is just improving more and more as it goes along. Titanic is sailing smoother and smoother. The crew is working out the kinks, and the designer's on board, Thomas Andrews. So he is basically troubleshooting the ship. He brought along a team of 8, I believe it was, shipyard workers from Belfast, and their job was essentially to test the ship and fix any problems throughout the voyage should anything come up. And there were problems. There were a few of these problems that did come up, particularly in the kitchen or with the heating and things like this that these crewmen from the Harlan and Wolff shipyards alongside Thomas Andrews did end up having to fix. So there it is. That's today. That's April 12th. Now, all right, let's start going into the purpose of this podcast. But by the way, I wanted to say something kind of personal first. I listened back to the podcast from April 10th, the part that I missed, and even part of the part where I was there. And I wanted to apologize if I sounded a little obnoxious or arrogant when I returned. I made a few jokes which were meant sarcastically, such as when I saw we had 500 people and I said that's it. That was more so a joke because 500 is clearly a lot. I meant to like, oh, that's it. But I guess it's kind of hard for me to convey my sense of humor if you guys can't see me. So my mistake there.
You have no humor.
What's that?
Never mind. I said you have no humor.
I have no humor? What?
Exactly.
All right. Well, anyway, yeah, I just wanted to say that because I listened back and I kind of cringed a little bit. So again, I apologize for that. But anyway, all right. So let's jump into this. Let's jump right into this. This is a list that we've put together of sort of miracles, things that seemed bad on the surface or how things easily could have gone differently and would have made the situation of the Titanic so much worse. We have a list of 6 right here. One of the biggest ones that we've been focusing on a lot lately because it's been in the news a lot is the coal fire. Now, I know we've explained this so many times, and I'm sure some of you are probably getting tired of hearing it, but we would be remiss if we didn't include it in this podcast because ultimately the coal fire is one of the absolute best things to have ever happened to the Titanic. It's the
and considering
go on, Kyle.
Considering the recent popularity of the coal fire theory, I don't think this can be said enough.
I know. Yeah, it's so popular, and that's great. We love to see people interested in the Titanic, and we love to see the news covering Titanic. But it's kind of frustrating because it's shown so misleadingly. It's sensationalized. They love saying that the coal fire was fatal. It's what sank the Titanic. No, I'm sorry. I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I like to think the iceberg sank the Titanic. But the coal fire actually did play. What's that?
Nothing.
Oh, that was a conspiracy. The coal fire actually did play into the sinking, but in a better way than one might expect. Okay, so coal fires were pretty common on ships at the time. So they let the ship go out to sea with the coal fire burning, and, no big deal. It happens on ships. It's not going to burn out of control. It's not going to do any damage. It's not going to cause any real trouble. They can take care of it. But in order to put these coal fires out, you have to shift the weight or not shift the weight, I'm sorry. You have to move the coal out of the burning area, which ultimately does shift the weight of the ship. So they've got 300 tons of coal in this coal chute on the starboard side of the ship. And in order to put it out, you have to move all of the coal out of the starboard side of the ship in that coal chute and put it somewhere else. And the most convenient place to put it is on the port side, the opposite coal chute. So they do that. They empty 300 tons of coal out of that side, and they put 300 tons onto the opposite side. They shift that weight. So 300 taken away from one, 300 added to the other is ultimately a shift of weight in the ship's balance of 600 tons. That's a lot. Considering the ship is only 45 or 46,000 tons, that's somewhat significant. I mean, that's almost a percentage of the weight. Of course, the weight of the coal is not factored into the weight of the ship, I believe, but still, it's a comparable number. As a result, the ship was leaning 3 degrees to the port, or up to 3 degrees, somewhere between 2 and 3. Well, no big deal. Ships leaned all the time. It was unnoticeable to 90% of the people on board. A couple people noticed it, but they simply didn't mind. They simply just took a note and said, hey, the ship seems to be leaning. All right, so the Titanic continues on its voyage. The fire is put out. But then the ship hits the iceberg and starts to sink. Now, how could the ship being on fire actually be considered what we're calling a miracle here for this podcast? How could this coal fire end up being a good thing? How could a ship on fire being a good thing? Well, when the Titanic hits the iceberg, it rips open the starboard side of the ship, and it starts to sink. We all know this. But if you look at almost every other ship in history, they capsize. They capsize after about an hour of sinking. The Costa Concordia capsized. The Lusitania capsized. The Britannic, the nearly identical sister ship to the Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, capsized. The Andrea Doria capsized. The Empress of Ireland, they all roll over onto their side and sink. Why did Titanic not? Especially when almost a third of its entire side is ripped open. Well, one of our advisors, Park Stevenson, he's the one who came up with this theory. And in fact, he titled the coal fire as Titanic's guardian angel. He was doing a computer simulation alongside naval architects, and they were basically feeding the structure and the properties, the engineering properties of the Titanic into a computer simulator. They put the proper damage in, they put the proper weights in, and then they let it sink. And it said that the Titanic should have rolled over about an hour after the collision. But we obviously know it didn't. We know it lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. How come this computer simulation is saying the Titanic should have rolled over about an hour after the collision? And let's not forget, Thomas Andrews, the chief architect, is on board. And he says that the Titanic has only about an hour. I mean, he did the calculations right, but there's one detail that he did not consider, and there's one detail that was originally not put into that computer simulation. And then Park suddenly realized, oh, that's right. Titanic was leaning 3 degrees in the opposite direction. They fed that into the computer simulation, and the computer then put back the results, and it said Titanic would start going down, and it would lean a little bit to the starboard, and then the water would reach Scotland Road and the open door, and it would start leaning back the opposite way. And it should sink in about 2.5 to 3 hours. So the fact that the Titanic was leaning 3 degrees to port gave the ship just enough counterbalance to prevent it from rolling over like almost every other ship in history. That coal fire was the reason for this 3 degrees off to the side. So let's just take in the fact that the first lifeboat from the Titanic left an hour and 5 minutes after the collision. If Titanic was going to roll over an hour after the collision, this means the Titanic would have sank without a single lifeboat escaping, which means Titanic would have disappeared in the middle of the night without a single survivor, had it not been for that coal fire. So there's that. That's our Titanic miracle number one. Our Titanic miracle number one. Right. Kyle, you did a visualization for Parks when he wrote up his article for the Titanic Historical Society. Do you want to maybe describe that a little bit?
For the for the list.
Yes.
Not much to describe. It was basically just a render looking toward the front of the ship, I believe, and it just showed the extent to which the ship tilted to one side to port. Or was it? Yeah, was it the port? Yeah. And when you look at it, I don't have it available right now. I have to find it. But it was quite a lot. Like if you look at it right from the front at a nice sort of short field of view, it's very apparent. Like the list is very noticeable. Like people, I'm sure if you would have put a marble on deck or something, it would have rolled that way. I mean, it would have rolled anyway because of the deck shear, but it was quite a good list. I mean, it's easy to see why it would have affected the sinking.
That's right. That's right. It's just, I always wondered why the Titanic didn't roll over. I mean, even when I was younger, I was wondering why it didn't roll over. Not necessarily because I couldn't understand the physics of it. Even when I was younger, I couldn't understand the physics of it, and I got that I couldn't understand it. But I did wonder why all these other ships rolled over, and why Titanic didn't. So this was actually really interesting when Parks explained this to me, and that was cool. All right, so there it is, Titanic miracle number one, numero uno. Numero dos is actually another one of those big things that easily could have changed the outcome of the story of the Titanic. Very easily could have. But because...
I already forgot what it was.
Oh, well, I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to spoil it.
Oh, I remembered. Okay, good.
Okay, good. This easily could have resulted in the loss of, again, possibly everyone on board, although that is slightly less likely than the coal fire. Had it not been for the decision of two young crewmen to break the rules. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk about my friends Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two telegraph operators of the Titanic. Well, they were sending out messages throughout the voyage. They were receiving messages. They were doing their job. And then late at night on the evening of the 13th, suddenly the telegraph machine just stops working. Well, the telegraph machine is the only communication Titanic has with any other ships. There's no way to communicate with any other thing unless you specifically use the lights or the Morse lamps or the rockets. But again, those only have a range of up to 10 miles perhaps, while the telegraph can go up to 1,000 miles on a really good day. So the telegraph is really the only reasonable means of communicating with other vessels or sending out a general call. And unfortunately, the evening of April 13th, just 24 hours before the collision, it breaks. whole machine just dies. From what I understand, something overheated and one of the parts melted, and it burned the thing out. Well, the Marconi manual, Marconi is the company that runs the Telegraph. The Marconi manual says, if the machine breaks, don't mess with it. Leave it broken and just wait till you get into harbor, and the repair crew will come on board and they will fix it. And the reason is, telegraph operators at the time were basically the tech geeks of 1912. They had a lot of the same mentalities that a lot of computer people today have. And I don't mean that as a slight in the least, but they often felt, oh, I can fix it. You know, if it breaks, I'll fix it. But the problem is the telegraph operators know how to use it really well. But the machines are so complicated that they don't know how to actually fix it or make it. And in more cases than not, these operators would try fixing it and just break it more. So the idea was, don't let them touch it. In fact, if you tried fixing it yourself, you could get in a lot of trouble with the company. You could get in trouble with Marconi. You might even get fired if you kept it up. So Titanic's telegraph broke. However, Phillips, the chief operator, decides, we're going to break that rule. I think we can fix it. And they spend 4 hours throughout the night, from just before midnight to a little after 4 in the morning. They're fixing the thing. And it gets a little bit more broken at first, I think, and then they ultimately got it. And then it kicks back on, and they turn it back on, and it works again. They didn't make it worse. These guys actually knew what they were doing. So good for them. But had they actually followed the rules, and had they not tried to fix it and just left it, Titanic's telegraph would have been disabled during the sinking and therefore unable to communicate. Now, I don't mean to be misleading. Titanic actually did have a backup set called the emergency set, but it could only transmit about 50 miles perhaps. Whereas, of course, the main telegraph could go 1,000 on a good day. Which means the emergency set more or less might not even have been able to contact the closest ships, such as the Carpathia. So had this machine not been repaired, Titanic wouldn't have been able to communicate with anyone, and no rescue ships would have been called. So, while this doesn't actually affect the lifeboats still would have been launched. The lifeboats still would have gotten away, no problem, just the same as they did. This means that they would have been drifting. And who knows how long it would have taken for them to finally be picked up by a ship that just coincidentally goes through the area. But
Yep.
let's also not forget that Titanic was 20 miles off course.
There's a lot of what ifs that you have to put into effect here.
Exactly. So with Titanic being 20 miles off course and just its lifeboats drifting, people would have died. More people would have died in the lifeboats. I mean, people were already dying in the lifeboats, but that number would have dwindled. And then who knows how long you would have had to sit in those boats. Would food and water have eventually become an option? So,
Not every boat was stocked with water and bread. Some lifeboats got bread put into them from down below, but not all of them. A lot of passengers said that they didn't have any supplies in the boats.
that's right. So, if not for Phillips and Bride deciding we're going to break the rules, we got this, then Titanic would not have been able to call for help. Now, could you imagine if Titanic wasn't on fire and if it didn't have a telegraph? Well, actually, I don't think that would have. Had Titanic rolled over, it literally couldn't have gotten any worse. So, never mind.
Mhm.
With or without the telegraph. Next one, number 3, is a little bit more controversial. I think,
We're going back to lifeboats?
yeah, we're going back to lifeboats.
Oh gosh.
Some of you guys already know this because we've advocated for this in the past. But if this is your first time listening to us, you hear this, you're probably going to immediately disagree. But hear us out. Titanic had 20 lifeboats, 14 regular lifeboats, 4 emergency collapsible rafts, and 2 emergency cutters. So Titanic had 20 lifeboats total with a capacity of about 1,200 seats, which was a good thing. I said it.
It was a very good thing.
I said it, yeah. We said it. Had Titanic had more lifeboats, it would have been a problem. An absolute problem. It would have made things a lot worse. Now, I'm not going to venture a guess and say that 20 is the perfect number. You know, maybe 22 or 24 might have been good. But people like to say Titanic needed 48 or 64 lifeboats. And had Titanic had 48 or 60 lifeboats, more people would have died. They absolutely would have died. There was nowhere to put these lifeboats. I mean, yeah, you could have knocked out that middle section and put in more boats like they eventually did on the Olympic, and maybe that would have been fine. But that's only like an additional 8. There's no real convenient place to put an additional 20 or 40 lifeboats. The only place you could put them is if you stack them inside of the other lifeboats. In order to do that, during the sinking, you've got to pull those lifeboats out. You have to unstack them, put them somewhere on the deck, have the passengers walk over these spare lifeboats to get into the lifeboats that are swung out, and then lower them. That's a hassle. And Titanic barely had the crew to get her 20 lifeboats away anyway. In fact, the last 2 had to float away. They didn't get to successfully launch the last 2 lifeboats because the ship sank too fast. The last lifeboats had to float off.
Yeah, and it's important to note too, as Parks has stated before, that the boats weren't meant to be loaded from the boat deck. They were meant to be lowered to A deck and loaded from there.
Huh. That is true, Kyle. That is also true.
And Titanic's extra sort of wall along a portion of A deck was a problem for that.
Yes, they had a hard time getting through the windows in the newly enclosed A deck promenade. In fact, one of the lifeboats, the upper lifeboats in the the lifeboats in the forward section of the ship, they didn't even launch them from A deck because it was too inconvenient. Some of the aft lifeboats were launched through the A deck promenade, but only one lifeboat was launched from A deck in the forward section. That was Lifeboat 4. My neighbor's deciding to mow his lawn right now. Do you guys hear that?
Affirmative.
You do? I'm sorry, there's literally nothing I can do about that. The windows are closed. So they tried launching Lifeboat 4 from A deck. Officer Lightaller, Second Officer Lightaller, lowers it down to A, and he tells a bunch of crew to take a bunch of passengers down to A and load it up through the windows. And then he moves on to other lifeboats. But he doesn't find out until later that the latch or the key they need to open the windows is missing. So he comes back an hour or so later and finds the same crowd of people is standing on A deck, still waiting to get into the lifeboat, which he thought was gone long ago. And he was shocked and honestly quite a little pissed off that they're still here. And he goes down there. Finally, they get the key to open it up. And then people start climbing in. And the ship's leaning over to the left at this point. It's starting to try to roll over. It doesn't roll over, but it is showing signs of rolling. And it's leaning over in that direction of the boat. They have to actually get deck chairs. Sorry, they have to get deck chairs and use them as bridges to get into the lifeboat. So, had Titanic had more lifeboats, This would have just added to the chaos of the evacuation. Because you got to keep in mind that the lifeboats were not meant to evacuate people and then have them sit in them. They were meant as ferries between a stricken ship and a rescue ship, because the idea was the rescue ship would get there. Ships are so close to each other, and everyone's got a telegraph. You're fine. And another ship would row up, and they would launch their lifeboats, and the Titanic's lifeboats would combine with their fleet and go back and forth as ferries until everyone got off.
I always wonder what would happen if Olympic encountered an accident where she was going to sink. Because we know Britannic sank, and her lifeboats and her davits were completely redesigned. And I look at Lusitania, and when she went down, she had a similar setup as Olympic did, where they had different lifeboat davits. They had the older lifeboat davits, but they had lifeboats that were they had the regular larger davits, but larger lifeboats, but then they had collapsibles, I believe, underneath. So they had the lifeboats stacked, just like Olympic did, and then what Titanic would have had if she had the 64 lifeboats. And we know, well, of course, Lusitania, she listed to the starboard side as she sank, but the majority of her boats didn't get away in time. And I'm just curious. I'd imagine that in that situation, if it happened to Olympic, with all the lifeboats that were added to her as well, I don't know if her Welland davits would have been efficient enough in getting away the boats. So I think it's more along the lines of that type of davit with those type of boats. Even though they were new davits which could handle those boats, all those boats, 3 or 4 boats at a time, in succession, it was still not enough time to lower them regardless. You needed a whole different type of davit. Perhaps the gigantic, ugly, quote-unquote, davits that Britannic had, the gantry davits. Those were efficient enough. While the single-acting Welland davits that they installed on Britannic for her wartime service, they didn't, well, we don't actually know, but they didn't get as many boats off as the gantry davits seemed to have got off in time.
That's right. Is there anything else to cover on this? Because I actually want to backtrack for a moment to coal fire. But I want to complete this topic first. Is there anything else we should add?
I don't think so. I think I just wanted to cover that a little bit about the other ships having so many other lifeboats, but they still don't get them off in time. Granted, of course, they didn't sink as Titanic did.
But they sank as Titanic should have sunk.
It's true, yes.
Not for the coal fire.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? I also think that perhaps the rolling over is a consideration that a lot of the architects probably took in mind. They probably realized that these ships roll over. And when a ship is leaning, it disables half of the lifeboat. So it's quite possible that they took this in mind and said to themselves, well, in theory, if 64 lifeboats carries everybody, and most ships have half their lifeboats disabled during a disaster, in theory, you should have 64 boats on either side. And perhaps they saw that and just thought, that's impractical and impossible.
Yeah.
So they came up with the idea of just ferrying back and forth.
Yeah, even in Titanic's case, it didn't roll over, but there were still, boats are still scraping the side, and it just makes it very, like, yeah, it could just, you can have all the lifeboats you want, but it can still be a problem. The Costa Concordia, that's a modern ship with modern davits that could very efficiently launch lifeboats, and they still couldn't get all their boats away before it sunk.
That's right. A lot of people jumped.
And a lot of people are still on the ship.
Yeah. In fact, the only reason Costa Concordia turned out not to be a massive disaster, I mean, it was still a disaster, sure. But the reason the death toll was only 32, and again, I'm not downplaying the number 32. The reason it wasn't astronomically more is because it was literally within a couple hundred feet of land. So that was just pure luck right there.
Yeah, right. They got like pushed right into shallow waters, by the wind basically, and they just got lucky.
That's right. People were able to jump and swim the land. Matt, I hear a lot of microphone noise. Are you muted or is that going through? Okay, good. Sorry about that, guys. Let me jump back to coal fire real quick. Just got an email from one of our friends and advisor, Ken Marshall, who's listening to the podcast, and he said we might want to make note of the fact that Smithsonian is airing another documentary about the coal fire. We don't know anything about it. In fact, honestly, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. We don't know if they're going in the same direction as the first documentary. We don't know if it's a rebranding of the first documentary. Maybe they're finally coming out and admitting how ridiculous the coal fire being fatal theory is. But Ken says it is airing this Saturday on the Smithsonian Channel at 8 and 11 p.m. So thank you, Ken. Thanks for letting us know that. And if you have time or interest, make sure you tune into that. So those are the three big miracles of the Titanic to consider. Then there's three smaller ones, which I'm going to get into. One of them is actually not too small. So we just talked about the telegraph operators and how they repaired their machines. But there's another stroke of good luck that came in that relates to the telegraphs that really would have changed the story of the Titanic. Maybe not extremely. Maybe not too extremely, but definitely to a noticeable degree. And that was the fact that, you know how the Californian was signed off for the night? They turned off their radios and then they went to sleep. People in hindsight like to look back on that with shame. But the truth is that's not anything to be ashamed of. That was standard procedure at the time. It was just very unfortunate with the timing. But the Californian only had one operator, so he had to sleep. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is the Carpathia was also signed off for the night. Harold Cottam, the telegraph operator, the only telegraph operator of the Carpathia, had signed off the machines. He was done. He was out hanging out on the deck with his friend, which I think was an officer, and they were talking for a while and just looking out into the night, looking out onto the horizon. I see some icebergs because the Carpathia had also stopped for the night because she was surrounded by ice. And then he decides, I'm going to go to bed. He walks back into his cabin and he does what he doesn't need to do. This is not a requirement, but he just happened to do it. As he was getting undressed for bed, he turned the machines back on just to see what was going on. And just as he turned it on, he doesn't hear Titanic. He hears Cape Race messaging Titanic. Now, most ships have a weaker wireless system than Titanic, and he didn't realize that that Titanic was already talking to Cape Race, and therefore they were within range of each other. And so he hears Cape Race, and he thinks, oh, well, I might as well let Titanic know that Cape Race is trying to contact. So he sends out this message saying, oh man, do you know that Cape Race has a bunch of messages for you? Well, Titanic hears the volume of the spark. He hears how close the Carpathia is, and he jumps on it. He doesn't even let the Carpathia finish his message. Phillips jumps the machine into transmit and interrupts, and he says, we have struck an iceberg. We are going down by the bow. This is our position. Notify your captain immediately. So Cottam jumps off. He runs. He tells the captain. He comes back and he says, we're coming for you. And this is all because he decided to turn on his machine just to see what was going on. And then he took the initiative just to let Titanic know, not knowing Titanic is sinking, that Cape Race, Newfoundland, Canada, has messages for the Titanic. So, had he not done that, Carpathia would not have turned to come to the Titanic. Now, there is a chance that this might not have had too much of an effect yes, the Carpathia was the rescue ship for everybody, but there were other ships on the way. At this point, other ships were notified and they were on their way. And just a couple hours after the Carpathia picked up the people, the Californian arrived on the site anyway. So it is quite possible that the Californian might have been the rescue ship after all, had it not been for the Carpathia turning its radio on just to see what was going on. So I can't venture to say that far more people would have died. I would venture to say certainly a couple more people would have died had it not been for the Carpathia showing up. And of course, the crew of the Carpathia and the captain of the Carpathia were extreme heroes. But none of that would have happened had it not been for Harold Cottam turning on the set and listening in. And fun fact, Cottam was actually friends with Harold Bride. So they knew each other, and Bride actually ended up helping Cottam once they were on board. So there you go, number 4. Matt, Kyle, would you like to add anything?
I'm not sure if you said it, but wasn't he just undressing, ready for bed? It kind of shows that it continues the theme that the wireless operators are just geeks of the day, and so he was just like, I'm just kind of bored still. I'll listen in, I don't have to respond, but I'm still kind of interested to see what's happening, you know.
Yeah.
Those young kids and
Young
their
kids and their
wireless telegraphy.
and their wireless rock music.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, even it shows that he sees it as even a hobby. In addition to his work, it's also a hobby. It's what he likes to do in his free time. So here he is just undressing and he casually decides, well, I got a few minutes to kill. I'm going to put it on. I'm going to listen. So yeah, it's very much the computer geeks of the time, which is cool. It's also really interesting to look at how times haven't changed all that much. Society has changed, technology has changed, but people haven't. There's always a group of people who crave the most up-to-date technology and every new gadget that's coming out, and they're just naturally attracted to it. And the people back then who are jumping on these telegraphs and setting up their own machines in their gardens like Bride did, and working on the Titanic and other ships as the telegraph operator, those people are the same people who today would be having the coolest computers, building their own computers from parts they order, and always staying up to date on the newest cool Titanic video game that's coming out. So
Oh yeah, or buying the
yeah,
newest phone. I guess that's where I was going with that. But if you want to just plug the game, that's fine too.
yeah. If you guys haven't heard, we're also making a game. They'd be the virtual reality headset guys, the ones playing our demos. So there's number 4. Number 5. We're gonna talk about this. This is not necessarily what you would call a miracle for the overall story of the Titanic, but for some individuals it was. Let's talk a little bit about the people who were supposed to be on the Titanic, but were not. Either they missed it by accident, or they simply couldn't do it, or something else. One story that is quite popular are the Slade brothers from Southampton, England. We've talked about this a few times. I think you talked about it in the April 10th podcast, correct?
Yeah, we did. We forgot their names, but we talked about them briefly.
Okay, well then, do we need to tell the story again, or
I don't know. I guess you can just briefly talk about it.
Okay, well,
Spark notes.
they were in Southampton. They were supposed to be firemen on the Titanic, or stokers, or engineers. Basically, the engine room crew of the Titanic, the boiler room crew. It was the 3 brothers and 2 of their friends. It was someone's birthday. I don't know whose birthday it was, but the 5 of them were celebrating it. And they were in a pub called The Grapes of Southampton on Oxford Street. We were there in our research trip. We actually have a video of us visiting it from when we did our daily video tour of England. And, that's the place where we shot the awful pool game. And they were in there drinking before walking over to the Titanic, and they decided, we're going to have one more round before we walk out to the Titanic. They did, and they're cutting it really close to Titanic's departure. All right, well, now they got to run. The two friends leave early, and then the three brothers stay behind. Maybe that's where they got their last round. I can't quite recall, or maybe the details are just lost to history. But the two friends moved ahead, and the three engineers were some distance behind, and they go entering the shipyard, and they have to cross a train track. And as the two friends cross it, they go ahead. But before the three brothers catch up, a train, a very, very slow train, cuts them off, and they have to wait for it to pass. Well, now it's just a few minutes for Titanic's departure. The whistles are blowing, and this train is just moseying on along, and then finally it's passed. And these are long trains, by the way. Shipyard cargo trains are very long. Finally it's passed, and they go rushing in, and they go rushing up the gangway, and I think it's Officer Moody who they talk to, who's there at the gangway door. And they said, well, we're firing, we have to come on board. And the gangway had already been pulled away, the door was already half closed, and Officer Moody turns to them and he says, I'm sorry, you missed it. And he closes the door. And the three brothers, as a result, missed the Titanic. All because of that one last round they decided to get, and all because of that train which cut them off. And they thought the train would have been a bad thing. Obviously, they thought missing the Titanic was a bad thing, because for these guys, this is their only income. And if they don't have work, they don't have money. And it's a problem. But considering how poorly the crew did during the sinking, I in terms of survival, I mean, considering how bad the numbers were for the crew survival rates, it's more than likely that those three would not have survived. Or at the very least, not all three would have survived. So that was a miracle for them. And in fact, the Grapes pub, which they were drinking at, is going to be in our game. You can explore Southampton before boarding the Titanic. There's actually storyline going on in it as you're going up to the Titanic. And the Grapes pub is going to be explorable accurately, or as accurately as we can. Now, the fortuitousness of the Slade brothers having survived didn't quite end right there. It didn't just save their lives. But one little fun story that we've picked up when we were in Southampton from a local friend of mine who is also a tour guide who told me this story, and it's in that video that we posted already, but I'm going to recap it for those of you who missed it. During World War II, during the Blitzes, a lot of the civilians would go into the vaults of Southampton, hide under there, and then they would come out when the bombers had passed. And the Slade brothers were going down the street, and they hear someone screaming for help just after an air raid. And they look down, and there's a vault under the street, and it's empty, except for a mother and her baby. And she's pinned under a pipe, a water main actually, and the water main is flooding the vault. She can't get out. So the Slade brothers are in a truck, and they use the truck, the winch from the truck, to pull the pipe, lift it off of her, and they ultimately saved her and her baby. Had the Slade brothers died on the Titanic, it's more than likely that that woman, whose name we mentioned in the video, I can't recall it offhand, she and her baby would not have survived. Now let's continue on to a couple other people who were supposed to be on the Titanic, weren't. And actually, the next person we're going to discuss was on the Titanic, but got off in Queenstown. Francis Brown boarded in Southampton. He was the photographer who took most of the onboard pictures that we're all familiar with. Now, he befriended an American couple on the Titanic. They got along so well that this American couple offered to Brown, instead of getting off in Ireland, we'll buy you a first-class ticket, and you can come all the way over to America. and tour America and do your photography, and then you can come back. And they offered, we're going to pay your ticket. Brown actually really liked the idea. He liked them. He liked the idea. So he sent a telegram home to his priest or his bishop, because he was a priest in training. So I guess he sent a telegram to his bishop, and he said, "Can I take them up on this offer?" And the bishop said, "No, absolutely not." Didn't give a reason why. He just said, "Absolutely not." So he got off in Ireland as planned, as opposed to taking them up on the offer to stay with the Titanic all the way across to New York. Now, there were 8 clergymen on the Titanic who stayed with it and went down with the ship, and more than likely, Francis Brown would have been a 9th one to stay on the Titanic and go down with the ship. So it was very fortunate for him, at least in the long run. Now, I don't know how he felt about it. Being a clergyman, I don't know if he would have felt like I should have been there. But from a practical standpoint, it was very lucky for him. And it's also very lucky for us, because had he stayed on the Titanic, his photographs would have gone down with it. All right, so I see in the comments someone asks, what kind of camera did Father Brown have? Sorry, he wasn't a father at the time. What kind of camera did Francis Brown have? It was a Kodak VP 1911 model, which you can see in the game. You can see it sitting on the wash basin in Brown's cabin on A deck, just opposite Thomas Andrews' cabin. Now, a couple other people worth mentioning that just missed the boat, and I won't go too into their story, because there's just so many. But there are a number of notable passengers who had tickets for the Titanic but didn't go. One of them is the famous J.P. Morgan. While Bruce Ismay is the owner of the White Star Line, or the director of the White Star Line, and technically the owner of the Titanic, J.P. Morgan and his company owned him. They owned the White Star Line as a parent company. So ultimately, J.P. Morgan was the ultimate owner of the Titanic, and he was supposed to be on board. He had a ticket, and for one reason or another, he didn't go. He was supposed to have the private promenade suite, which Ismay ended up taking.
Supposedly.
Unfortunately for conspiracy theorists, the fact that Morgan had a ticket and then didn't go really fuels the false rumors that Morgan sank it on purpose for insurance. A couple other notable passengers who had tickets but didn't go was Milton Hershey, the famous Pennsylvania chocolatier and inventor. He was supposed to be on the Titanic. He and his family were traveling through Europe on vacation and business, I believe, and they had a ticket on the maiden voyage of the Titanic back home from Europe. But his wife got sick about 2 weeks in advance of the Titanic, and they decided that we got to cut our vacation short. We're going to come home early, and I think they booked a ticket on the Lusitania, and they made it home without incident. Now, some people speculate there wouldn't be Hershey chocolate today, if not for Milton Hershey. But I want to throw out the fact that Hershey's chocolate was already founded, but he's the one who was very innovative. He's the one who carried the business to become what it really truly is today. But it's quite possible that the company might have folded or been led down a bad road, that Milton Hershey didn't take it down, and ultimately it might have disappeared. So it was already founded, but it might have disappeared.
Yeah, I kind of, and that could happen with other, I mentioned the other day that And for a modern example was, Seth MacFarlane was almost, he missed his plane on 9/11 by a few minutes, and he would have been on one of the planes that crashed that day, but he wasn't. But if he was, Family Guy still would have existed. It just would have lasted less time, probably.
There's another miracle. We still have Family Guy. Couple other people. Matt, you sent me a list of a few other names to mention.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you just say the names since you found them?
Okay. I have a dog barking. That's why I sent them. But a few.
I can say it if you want.
Oh, okay. As long as she stops it, you terrible dog. A few other was, well, you like talking about the wireless. That's why I sent one. Was Mr. Marconi himself was supposed to be on board.
That's right. He went on the Lusitania as well.
He did. He was offered a free passage, I believe, on Titanic, but he had to get there earlier. To New York, so, or something or other. I'm not positive. So he had to take the Lusitania, or it was one thing or another. And
Right.
also was one of the Vanderbilts. I think it was George Vanderbilt the second, not the one who was on Lusitania when she sank. Um, he was going to be on board as well, along with his wife, I think. But they canceled their trip as well.
Right. So there's a lot of people who were supposed to be on the Titanic. I mean, we already have a lot of influential people. We have one of the presidential advisors on board. We have famous art collectors and film stars and politicians, all sorts of influential and famous people on the Titanic. Could you have imagined if no one missed the Titanic? Could you have imagined if J.P. Morgan and Marconi and Vanderbilt and Hershey and the Slade brothers had been on board? How different the world today would be.
The world is already different enough. So yes, already changed enough from Titanic.
That's right. So there's a lot of changes that would have happened to the world in addition to what we already have. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is not so much someone who wasn't on the Titanic, but more so something to be thankful about regarding someone being on the Titanic, actually having been there. And that was the chief architect, Thomas Andrews. Now, it was standard practice that the chief architect is always on board when a ship has a maiden voyage. Just like it was standard tradition that Bruce Ismay, the owner, would be on board for the maiden voyage. And their best captain would be on board for the maiden voyage. And that's also why Marconi got an invite, because his machines are on board. So they really tried to get the important people of the owners or the designers all on board. Basically, so if there was a problem, then they could help to fix it. But in Titanic's case, they had the ultimate problem. The ship started sinking. Now, Thomas Andrews was on board, and he was doing stuff all throughout the voyage. He was fixing things with the Guarantee Group, which I had mentioned earlier, and he was also a very well-liked person. So his presence was also a social thing. A lot of the passengers loved him. In fact, a lot of the people during the sinking, when they recite their stories of how they got off, they a lot of times can name Andrews. They can point out the architect by name. They can say, I saw Thomas Andrews or Tommy Andrews for the ones who knew him on a personal note. And a lot of them really liked his presence and really liked him as a person. So him being on board during the sinking was also beneficial for a lot of the people. He's the one who knew what to do. He's the one who declared the ship sinking. He's the one who knew how to tell if the ship was going to survive or not. He's the one who knew how to buy extra time to keep it afloat. Had Andrews not have been on board, it would have taken longer for them to realize the ship was sinking. Um, in fact, the crew was in disbelief. It took Thomas Andrews about 35 to 45 minutes to say, yes, the Titanic is going to sink. And at that point, the ship seemed so stable. If you've watched our real-time sinking, if you haven't, you can watch it tomorrow, but if you've watched it, you'll realize just how long it took for it to even be noticeably leaning forward. And even then, you wouldn't be feeling it if you're on board. So for him to go through and look at the damage and do some mathematical calculations, here there's a formula that you have to follow in order to see if your ship's going to survive or not. And he did that formula, and he did some other estimates, and he factored in the pumps, he factored in the damage to the other places, he factored in everything you could possibly do. And he talked to the captain. He said, we're going to sink. He talked to Ismay, and he said, we're going to sink. And the captain and Ismay didn't believe him. Now, of course, they believed him. I should say they did believe him. It's not like they doubted him, but they were just in such disbelief. So the point I'm trying to get at is, had Andrews not have been there to basically take the officers and all of the influential people on the Titanic and say, stop. There's nothing we can do to save the ship. Start evacuating. Had he not been there to say that, it's quite possible that the officers and the captain would have kept investigating. They might have taken longer. They would have been, there just would have been a lot of problems, and it would have taken a lot longer. And it would have delayed the evacuation. And with the last two lifeboats having to float off because they didn't have enough to begin with, they would have possibly gotten less lifeboats away. Now, on top of that, not only was Andrews there to declare the Titanic sinking and really put a stop to their efforts to save it and put a start to their efforts to evacuate, but he also was a very comforting figure throughout the sinking because, like I said earlier, everyone liked him. They respected him. They knew that he doesn't mess around. I don't mean to use the Cameron film as a reference, but they put a lot of research into that film, did a great job with it. You know, if you can look past the fictional love story, they did a great job with all of the research of the sets and the other characters. And I do really feel like the Thomas Andrews depiction in Cameron's Titanic and A Night to Remember is quite accurate. It's exactly how he was. He was the kind of guy who would walk around, he would give good advice, people would turn to him for advice. He had a family, so he wasn't all business. He certainly had emotions that he was able to sympathize with people and that people were able to sympathize with him. So it's shown in the Cameron film, but he also told a lot of the crew, you need to put on life belts. And this was for two purposes. Of course, this was because he valued human life as well, and he realized that these crew have lives, these crew families, they have a right to try to survive as well. But it was also so that it would set an example for the passengers. If the passengers don't see crew wearing life belts, well, then why are they going to take it seriously? But if they see the crew taking the situation seriously, then the passengers are going to listen and do as they're told, or at least they're more likely to. And that was Andrews as well. Andrews did try improving the situation even further. He actually went around yelling at some of the officers for launching the lifeboats empty, also as shown in the film. And then they started filling them fully. So that was also thanks to him. Then he rounded up the captain and Chief Officer Wild, and they got the megaphone, the captain's megaphone, and they started calling out to the half-empty lifeboats that were rowing away in an effort to call them back so that they could string ropes and ladders over the side and let more passengers climb down and take up the empty seat. Unfortunately, it was unsuccessful. None of the lifeboats came back. Some of them heard it, but they didn't come back. And again, Cameron's film does a great job showing us all the scene. So the fact that Thomas Andrews was on board, it cost him his life, which is terrible. But it saved so many others. And quite honestly, Andrews as a person, I think we know enough about his character that I would be so bold as to say that if he were given the choice, if he knew what was going to happen to the Titanic, and he was given the choice, do you want to go and be on the Titanic and go down with the ship but save lives? Or do you want to stay in Belfast with your new wife and newborn baby? I sincerely believe that Thomas Andrews would still choose to go to the Titanic and save people, because that's the kind of guy he was. So his presence helped so many people and made the Titanic disaster easier for some. And in a sense, he really is the epitome of the Titanic disaster in some ways. You know, a lot of people like to look at the Titanic and they see courage, they see bravery, they see the honor of helping others and staying by your post and not really making an effort to save yourself. Just staying gentlemanly and classy, accepting your fate but trying to save others. And Andrews really is the epitome of this. So Andrews being on board is one of the best things that could have happened to the people on the Titanic. But unfortunately, it cost him his life. So that's it. That's our list of 6 miracles that may or may not have seemed bad on the surface for the Titanic, but ultimately improved the situation astronomically in some cases for those on board. Matt, Kyle, do you have anything to add to any of those 6?
I think it's a good thing that it's not miracles. I know at first we got a lot of emails saying, what does it mean by miracle? And I don't know. Did we explain exactly what miracle meant in a sense? Miracles as not a divine intervention, but yes, it's just at the surface, it doesn't look like a good thing, but it is a great thing for certain people, for passengers and crew on board.
Yeah,
And
miracle is just a catchy word we decided to use.
yeah,
You can interpret it as divine intervention or whatever you want, but yeah, it's a catchy word we chose to use.
right, yes. But in a way, it is a miracle. Titanic had a lot of miracles on board, actually.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
That is very true. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Today we uploaded a video earlier about fashion on the Titanic, hosted by our fashion consultants, Annelies van Overbeek. And one of the things that she and I have been working on is also doing a contest, which everyone is invited to participate in. And the prize is going to be 2 books about Titanic and the style on board, one about Lady Duff Gordon and one about Titanic style in general. So if anyone's interested in participating in this contest, here's how you do it. You got to put together your best Edwardian era Titanic style costume, men or women. You know, we're looking for dresses, we're looking for suits, we're even looking for uniforms. Whatever you feel like putting together that just says Titanic, something that is just the epitome of 1912. Put together that, take a nice photograph, and we are considering the look of the photograph. So if you can get a nice background, if you can go somewhere that fits, and if you can get a nice setup to your photograph, all submissions are going through Instagram. Post it on Instagram and tag it with Titanic HG, as in Titanic Honor and Glory. You can tag her, Annalise, she's going to be one of the judges. I'm going to be. You can tag her. She's at Annalise Van Overbeek, or you can tag me at the Tominator 2. Tag us both, I should say. And if you can get those submissions in before April 19th, because that's when we're going to judge and announce the winners. Yeah, make sure you do that. And we're going to be sending out the prize, and that's it. That's everything. I have nothing more to add on that subject. Do it. I encourage you. And we might actually even post some of the best submissions on our Facebook. So please do so. She posted an Edwardian outfit for the contest. She and I aren't participating in it. But we did decide to put together photographs for fun, and she made a post today, and I have an officer uniform, which I took a picture, but I don't look good in it, so that's a problem. Make sure you do that. Go on Instagram.
People have cool costumes.
I know, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. So if you have any interest in vintage or cosplay or anything like that, hashtag TitanicHG, and tag at Annalise Van Overbeek and at the Tominator 2. And try to do that before April 19th. The sooner you get it in, the better. We've already had 2 or 3 submissions so far, and the contest has really only been up for a few hours, so that's really cool. That's it. That's everything. If you want, make sure you visit our website, make a contribution. We're still taking contributions for the passenger list perk, and those contributions do add up. We got a few messages in the recent few days asking if they add up. For example, if you give 75 and then 50 and then another 50, will you ultimately reach the 150 perk or the 250 perk? And yes, you do. We keep track of it. I should say Matt keeps track of it. He's very good at the accounting. And
yeah, I kind of went to school for it, so yeah.
I know. That's probably why you're good at it. So there you go. We got one now. Thank you. Cool. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Really appreciate that. Today's April 12th, and tomorrow we have April 13th. We will be discussing the collision. So make sure you tune in for that. We'll basically be talking about how the crew reacted, how some of the passengers reacted, and what they could have done. Actually, not so much what they could have done, because we firmly believe they did the best they possibly could. But we're going to talk about some of the alternate theories, such as should they have hit the iceberg head on and things like that. We're going to talk about that and hopefully dispel some of that nonsense. So make sure you tune in. We're not going to talk about that so much during the real-time sinking. It's just going to be too much. The collision is too much to cover. Because once the ship hits the iceberg, so much other stuff starts happening. And there's a lot to talk about during it. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Once more, now that I have everyone here, about the teaser trailer for the demo, we're not deliberately holding out on you guys. If it were ready, it would be uploaded the moment it's ready. But there's technical issues, as always. There's always technical issues that come with the engine or just programming such a big ship. We are learning the hard way, by the way, that there's no reason. There's certainly a good reason why no one else has really made a serious Titanic video game. But there's always technical issues. We're not holding out on you guys. We're not teasing you, even though it is a teaser trailer. It's just, we apologize. As soon as it's ready, it'll be up. But the more time it takes, the more features we are able to add to this trailer. And take our word for it when we say that it's looking really freaking good. It's looking really good. Yeah, so thank you all for tuning in. And I guess that's it. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
We'll see everybody tomorrow.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.